The sun bid farewell behind the hills of the Arizona desert, tinging the sky with copper tones that Grace Bennett observed with exhausted eyes. Her bare feet, blistered from the journey, barely supported her as she leaned against the old wooden fence that marked the boundary of that small property. Desert dust had adhered to her skin like second nature, just as sorrows had to her soul. Her long blonde hair, now dull and tangled, danced to the rhythm of the dry wind that seemed intent on stripping away her last remaining strength. In the distance, she spotted the figure of a man gathering hay. His silhouette, outlined against the reddish horizon, emanated the firmness of one accustomed to solitude. Grace felt a tremor run through her body. It wasn't just hunger or exhaustion. It was fear mixed with the desperation of someone who had lost everything. When he approached close enough, their gazes met. His eyes, deep and somber green like an impenetrable forest, examined her with a mixture of surprise and wariness. Grace tried to speak, but her parched throat only emitted a weak murmur. She swallowed hard and, gathering what little strength remained to her, pronounced the words she never thought she would say, I cannot live without a man." The desert wind seemed to stop after that confession. The man, Samuel Crawford as she would learn later, remained motionless, his brow furrowed beneath the brim of his worn hat. Grace felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she had nothing more to offer than that raw truth. She was alone, helpless, and the world had become too hostile a place for a homeless woman. "Do you have a name?" he finally asked, his voice rough as sand. Grace. Grace Bennett. The silence that followed weighed as heavily as the heat of the dying day. Samuel observed her carefully, and Grace could feel how he evaluated every inch of her being, perhaps searching for signs of danger or deceit. She remained firm despite the trembling in her knees, holding that gaze that seemed intent on unraveling all her secrets. "I have no family," she added. "And no direction," Samuel breathed deeply. Grace perceived the conflict in his expression, the internal struggle between distrust and something else, something she couldn't identify, but that opened a faint light of hope in her chest. Finally, without saying a word, he opened the wooden gate. The creak of rusted hinges echoed in the desert silence like an unexpected invitation, a portal towards something Grace didn't dare name. Perhaps it wasn't salvation, she thought, but at least it would be shelter. As she crossed the threshold of that property, Grace felt the weight of her declaration. "I cannot live without a man" wasn't just a plea born of desperation. It was the confession of someone who had hit rock bottom and was now seeking, among the ashes of her former life, the possibility of beginning again. Samuel Crawford's cabin was like him, austere, resistant and closed to the outside world. Grace observed every corner as he pointed her to a small bench beside the wooden table. The interior smelled of leather, earth and accumulated solitude. The bare walls barely retained some yellowed photographs, and the sparse furniture seemed to have been arranged more out of necessity than comfort. "Sit," he said, heading toward the small iron stove. Grace obeyed, aware that her every movement was scrutinized by those green eyes that seemed to contain stories as painful as her own. She watched his weathered hands as he lit the fire and placed a pot. Working hands, she thought, hands that knew the language of earth and animals better than that of people. The silence between them wasn't comfortable, but neither was it hostile. It was more like a wild animal that both feared to startle. Grace felt her heart beating strongly, wondering if she had made a mistake seeking refuge there. But when Samuel placed before her a plate of beans with a piece of hard bread, she felt tears come to her eyes. "Eat," he murmured. Sitting across from her with his hat now resting on the table, Grace didn't need to be told twice. She ate eagerly, feeling how each bite returned not only physical strength but also a shred of dignity. As she chewed, she felt Samuel's gaze upon her, not with pity but with restrained curiosity. "Where do you come from?" he finally asked. Grace swallowed with difficulty. How could she explain the paths of pain that had led her there? How could she summarize the loss, abandonment, the closed doors? "From nowhere now," she replied, and saw in Samuel's eyes a flash of recognition, as if that answer had touched something deep within him. When she finished eating, he handed her a worn blanket and pointed to a small cot in a corner. "You can sleep there tonight. We'll see tomorrow." Those words, "we'll see tomorrow," resonated inside Grace like an echo. It wasn't a promise, but neither was it a rejection. It was a waiting period, a space between yesterday and tomorrow where perhaps, Just perhaps she could find a place to belong. That night, wrapped in the blanket that smelled of earth and horses, Grace observed the desert stars through the small window. They shone with an intensity she had never seen in the city, as if the sky compensated for the barrenness of the earth with a display of light. In the night stillness, she heard Samuel's measured breathing as he slept in his adjoining room. For the first time in a long while, fear gave way to a different sensation, still fragile and nameless, but one that vaguely resembled hope. Dawn arrived with a golden radiance that filtered through the cracks of the cabin. Grace woke startled, disoriented for a moment until memories of the previous day returned to her like a wave. The cot creaked under her weight as she sat up, and her eyes surveyed the room now illuminated by morning light. The cabin, which last night had seemed only a somber refuge, now revealed its secrets: a table marked by use, mismatched chairs, shelves with few objects, but all arranged with meticulous precision. Everything spoke of a simple but dignified life, of a man who had found in solitude not punishment, but a form of existence. Grace rose quietly. There were no signs of Samuel, but she could hear movement outside. She approached the window and saw him feeding the horses in the corral. His figure cast a long shadow on the reddish earth, and for a moment Grace allowed herself to observe him unseen, the way his shoulders tensed when lifting the hay bales, the unexpected gentleness with which he caressed the animals' muzzles. Moving away from the window, Grace surveyed the room with new determination. If she was going to stay, even if only one more day, she had to prove her usefulness. Dust accumulated in corners, cobwebs adorned the ceiling, and the kitchen showed signs of years of neglect. Grace rolled up the sleeves of her worn dress and began to work. By the time Samuel returned to the cabin, the sun was already high in the sky. He stopped at the threshold, and Grace could read the surprise on his face as he contemplated the change. The swept floor, the clean table, and her standing beside the stove, stirring what little she had found to prepare a meal. "You didn't have to do this," he said, removing his hat with a gesture that Grace interpreted as involuntary respect. "I wanted to do it," she replied, meeting his gaze. "If I stay, it won't be for nothing." Something changed in Samuel's expression, an almost imperceptible softening of the hard lines around his mouth. "There's no place here for those who don't work," he said. But his tone had lost the roughness of the previous day. Grace nodded. She understood that language, that of effort and survival. It was the only one left to her after kind words and promises had vanished from her former life. As they ate the simple stew she had prepared, Grace noticed that Samuel was observing her with renewed curiosity. He wasn't looking at her as an intruder, but as an enigma that didn't fit into his ordered world of solitude. "Do you know anything about animals?" he finally asked. "I can learn," she answered, and perceived in her own tone a determination she thought lost. Samuel nodded slightly, as if sealing a tacit pact. It wasn't a promise of future, but of present. One more day, perhaps two. Time enough for Grace to prove she could be more than a burden, that she could become something necessary. That afternoon, under the relentless desert sun, Samuel showed her the basics of horse care. He taught her to distinguish good hay from bad, to check hooves, to speak to them with a calm voice that would soothe them. Grace listened attentively, absorbing every word, every gesture as if her life depended on it. And perhaps it did. When their hands brushed as he passed her the reins of one of the horses, Grace felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the desert wind. She saw how Samuel quickly withdrew his hand, as if the contact had burned him. But she also caught something else, a momentary vulnerability in those green eyes, a flash of something that could be longing. As night fell, exhausted, but with a satisfaction she hadn't felt in a long time, Grace contemplated the stars from the cabin's porch. This time Samuel sat beside her, maintaining a prudent distance but sharing the same sky, the same silence. They exchanged no words, but none were needed. In that first shared dawn, both had begun to learn a new language, one made of work, respect, and the possibility still remote of trust. Days passed, and Grace found in daily work a form of redemption. Her hands, once soft, now showed incipient calluses of which she felt secretly proud. Each blister, each aching muscle was proof of her worth, of her capacity to adapt and survive. The cabin had subtly changed under her care. Dust and cobwebs had disappeared, replaced by small touches that spoke of a feminine presence. a bouquet of wildflowers in an empty can, dishes arranged with aesthetic order, and what made her most proud, curtains she had sewn from an old wheat-colored flour sack she found in the shed. That morning, Grace hung them carefully in the main window. Sunlight, filtered through the coarse fabric, acquired a warmth that transformed the austere interior of the cabin. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Samuel enter until his grave voice startled her. "What is that?" Grace turned, uncertain how to interpret his tone. Was it disapproval, surprise? Samuel's eyes, habitually inscrutable, showed an expression she couldn't decipher. "Curtains," she replied simply, preparing for a reprimand for having taken the sack without permission. Samuel approached the window and touched the fabric with his rough fingers, as if examining something precious and fragile. "My mother had similar ones," he murmured, so low that Grace barely heard him. It was a fleeting comment, but for Grace it represented a crack in the wall Samuel had built around himself. A shared memory, a small but significant confidence. She felt warmth spread in her chest, different from exhaustion or the desert sun. "If you don't like them, I can take them down," she offered, though something inside her fervently hoped he would accept them, that he would accept this small change she had introduced into his ordered life. Samuel shook his head. "Leave them," he said, and though his expression closed again, Grace perceived that something had changed between them. That afternoon, while hanging clothes by the well, Grace began to hum softly a melody her mother used to sing when she was a child. It was a simple song about birds and freedom, a memory from more innocent times. She didn't realize Samuel had stopped to listen until she looked up and found him watching her from the fence. For an instant, Grace feared she had crossed another invisible line, disturbed the silence to which he was accustomed. But then Samuel said something that left her breathless. "Continue. Don't stop." His voice had an almost pleading quality, as if that simple melody offered him comfort he didn't know he needed. Grace resumed her singing, this time with more confidence, letting the notes float in the hot desert air, weaving an invisible bridge between them. Later, when night had fallen, and they dined by the light of the kerosene lamp, Grace dared to ask him about his life before solitude. Samuel remained silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer, but finally he spoke in a quiet voice. "I had a wife. Her name was Margaret. Fever took her 5 years ago." Grace felt her heart tighten. Now she better understood the emptiness that inhabited that cabin, the prolonged silences, the reluctance to let anything new enter. "I'm sorry," she said. Knowing the words were insufficient for the pain she sensed in him, Samuel nodded briefly, as if thanking her simple condolence, then steered the conversation toward the next day's tasks. But something had changed. The wheat-colored curtains that filtered the light, the shared song, the confession of a loss, small threads that were beginning to weave a new pattern between two solitary souls. That night, before sleeping, Grace again observed the stars through the window now adorned with her creation. The curtains danced gently with the night breeze, like a reminder that even the simplest things could transform a space, make habitable what had previously been only refuge. Perhaps, she thought, people could transform that way too, with small gestures, with half-voiced songs, with shared memories that, like seeds, only needed time and care to flourish. Rain arrived unexpectedly one afternoon, turning desert dust into red mud and bringing with it an aroma of wet earth that Grace inhaled with delight. Taking refuge in the cabin, she and Samuel found themselves sharing a space that suddenly seemed smaller, more intimate. Grace took advantage of that time of forced seclusion to bring out from the bottom of her small bundle of belongings a project she had been working on in secret. A dress she was trying to make from fabric scraps Samuel had allowed her to take from the chest where he kept old garments. The dress was of a faded blue, like a piece of sky captured in her inexpert hands. The stitches were irregular, some too tight, others too loose, but Grace had put into each one a determination that compensated for her lack of skill. Sitting by the window, taking advantage of the grayish light that filtered through the flour sack curtains, she continued her work while listening to the drumming of rain on the roof. She was so concentrated that she didn't notice Samuel's presence until his shadow fell across the fabric. "What are you doing?" he asked, with that contained curiosity Grace had learned to recognize. She felt a blush rise to her cheeks. The dress was her secret, her way of reclaiming a femininity she thought lost among hard work and survival. "A dress," she replied, resisting the impulse to hide it. "It's not very good, but—" She left the sentence unfinished, suddenly ashamed. What would he think of this vanity? Would he find it an unnecessary frivolity? To her surprise, Samuel sat across from her and extended his hand, wordlessly asking her to show him her work. Grace handed it to him timidly, aware of every imperfection, every crooked seam. Samuel's fingers, rough from work, but incredibly delicate in that moment, traced the fabric as if evaluating its resistance. His eyes, under his perpetually furrowed brow, studied every detail with an intensity that made Grace hold her breath. "It's more than solid," he said finally, returning the dress. "It's good." 3 simple words, but Grace felt she had been granted a precious gift. It wasn't an elaborate compliment, but coming from Samuel, from a man of silences and measured gestures, that approval meant more than 1,000 praises. "Thank you," she murmured. And when their eyes met, something tacit passed between them, a mutual recognition that went beyond words. The rain continued falling, creating a separate world where only the two of them existed, the sound of water on the roof and the soft rustle of fabric as Grace resumed her sewing. This time, however, she wasn't working in secret but under Samuel's attentive gaze, who had taken a book but barely turned the pages, as if he found more interest in watching her. At one point, when Grace pricked her finger with the needle and let out a muffled exclamation, Samuel rose without a word. He returned with a small jar containing an herbal salve. With a gesture that seemed to ask permission, he took her hand and carefully applied the ointment to the tiny wound. The contact of his calloused fingers on her skin sent an electric current up Grace's arm. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately, without the excuse of shared work. Their gazes met, and for an instant neither breathed. "Thank you," she whispered again, but this time the word contained many more meanings. Samuel nodded and returned to his seat, resuming his book as if nothing had happened. But something had changed, as subtle as the change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. That night, when Grace finally put on the finished dress, she looked at herself in the small cracked mirror she had found among forgotten belongings. The blue contrasted with her blonde hair, now brighter thanks to the care she could afford, and the form, though simple, highlighted curves that hard work hadn't managed to erase. When she emerged from her small corner and presented herself to Samuel for dinner, she saw how he froze, with a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. His eyes swept over her from top to bottom, and Grace felt herself blush under that scrutiny. "Is it all right?" she asked, suddenly insecure, fearing she had made a mistake. "Presumed too much." Samuel set down the bread and cleared his throat before responding. "It's—" He seemed to search for the right word. "Beautiful." Grace's heart skipped. It wasn't just the compliment. It was the way he had said it, with a voice that had lost its habitual roughness, with eyes that no longer hid their admiration. In that moment, under the trembling lamplight, with rain as background music, and wrapped in the blue dress her own hands had created, Grace felt herself reborn. Not as the desperate woman who had arrived begging for refuge, but as someone who was beginning to recognize herself, to find value in her own existence. And in Samuel's gaze, in that new brightness she saw in his green eyes, she found the reflection of that transformation. The desert had returned to its usual dryness when the first rays of sun illuminated the figures of 2 riders approaching the property. Grace spotted them from the corral, where she was brushing one of the horses with movements that already showed the confidence of routine. Something in the way those men approached, with deliberate and studied slowness, sent a chill of uneasiness through her. "Samuel," she called, without taking her eyes off the visitors. He emerged from the shed, wiping his hands on a rag. One glance was enough for his face to adopt that stony expression Grace had learned to recognize as his mask of defense against the outside world. "Go into the house," he ordered, with a tone that brooked no reply. Grace obeyed but stayed by the window, watching through the flour-sack curtains as Samuel headed toward the newcomers. She recognized them immediately. They were traveling merchants, the kind who roamed isolated properties selling goods and, more valuably, news from the outside world. She had seen them once before, shortly after her arrival, but then they hadn't approached the cabin. Samuel received them with his hand resting casually on the revolver at his belt, a gesture Grace knew was calculated to establish the terms of the encounter. The men dismounted, and she could hear fragments of the conversation. They asked for water for their horses, offered some products in exchange. Everything seemed to proceed with the distant formality usual in such encounters, until one of them, the taller and thinner, looked toward the cabin and saw her at the window. A slow smile, which seemed to Grace loaded with malice, drew itself on his bearded face. "So the rumors were true, Crawford," he said, in a tone that made Grace tense. "The woman of the road is now your companion." The other man let out a hoarse laugh. "It was about time someone gave shelter to that poor thing," he added, with false compassion that sounded like an insult. "Though I never thought it would be you who would take her in." Grace felt blush burn her cheeks. The woman of the road. So that's what they called her, what the outside world thought. A wandering woman without dignity, a burden someone had taken in out of compassion. Or something else. Samuel didn't respond immediately. The brim of his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, but Grace could see how his hand tensed on his revolver, how his jaw hardened. When he spoke, his voice sounded like gravel crushed under a boot. "Mount your horses and leave my property." He didn't raise his voice, made no threatening gesture beyond that hand resting on his weapon, but there was such authority in his words that the merchants exchanged a wary glance. "We were just joking, Crawford," said the shorter one, trying to lighten the tension. "You're no longer welcome here," Samuel replied, implacable. "Never again." Grace held her breath as the men, grumbling but evidently intimidated, remounted. Before leaving, the taller one spat on the ground, a final gesture of contempt that Samuel ignored with glacial dignity. When the riders disappeared in the distance, Samuel remained motionless for a long moment, like a statue carved from the desert's red stone. Grace then emerged from the cabin, her heart beating painfully against her ribs. She approached him with uncertain steps, aware that something had changed, that the fragile balance they had built in their small, isolated world had just been disturbed by the outside intrusion. "I'm just a source of mockery to them," she murmured. Her voice broken by humiliation and pain, Samuel turned toward her. The hardness of his expression hadn't softened, but there was something new in his eyes, an intensity that overwhelmed her. "No," he said firmly, approaching until he could take her face in his rough but surprisingly gentle hands. "You are the reason I'm no longer alone." Grace felt the world stop. Those words, spoken with the brutal simplicity with which Samuel said everything, contained a truth that left her breathless. It wasn't gratitude she heard in his voice, nor even affection. It was recognition, the admission of a need that went beyond practical companionship or help with daily tasks. The tears she had been holding back overflowed then, rolling down her cheeks and moistening Samuel's fingers. He didn't wipe them away, didn't show discomfort at this display of emotion. Instead, with his thumb, he cleaned one of them with a gesture so tender it contrasted with the usual roughness of his movements. "What they say doesn't matter," he continued, his gaze fixed on hers. "What matters is what's here." He didn't specify whether he referred to the property, the cabin they now shared, or something deeper and more indefinable that had arisen between them. But Grace understood. In that world reduced to two people, the malicious words of strangers lacked power. What they had built, day by day, gesture by gesture, silence by silence, was more real than any rumor or external judgment. When Samuel finally released her face and stepped back, Grace felt the ghost of his touch like a promise engraved on her skin. Without saying anything more, they returned together to the cabin, aware they had crossed another invisible threshold, that Samuel's defense against those men had also been a declaration, a positioning that defined their relationship in a new way. That night, sitting in front of the fireplace lit despite the heat, simply to chase away shadows, Grace felt a gratitude that went beyond words, not for shelter, not for food or protection, but for having found in the most unexpected place someone who saw her not as the woman of the road, but as Grace, simply Grace. Summer advanced, bringing with it heat that reverberated over the red earth in visible waves. Grace had developed a routine she found comforting, mornings dedicated to domestic tasks, afternoons to caring for animals alongside Samuel, evenings to sewing or simply contemplating the stars from the porch, sometimes alone, others in a shared silence that was no longer uncomfortable. That morning, while cleaning the small shed adjacent to the cabin, Grace found a carved wooden box hidden under rusty tools and old sacks. Curiosity overcame discretion, and she lifted the lid carefully, prepared to close it immediately if its contents proved too personal. Inside were several objects that clearly belonged to a woman: a brush with some dark hairs still tangled in its bristles, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials MC, a small perfume bottle almost empty. Grace immediately understood these were Margaret's belongings. Samuel's deceased wife. She was about to close the box, feeling like an intruder in a private sanctuary, when something caught her attention. A small, smooth stone of intense green veined with white, set in a simple leather cord. She took it carefully, feeling its weight in her palm, wondering what meaning that apparently insignificant object might have. It was hers. Samuel's voice behind her startled her. She turned, her heart beating rapidly, expecting to find anger in his face for having discovered those relics. But instead of rage, she saw a tranquil melancholy, almost resigned. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have," Grace began, extending her hand to return the stone. Samuel shook his head. Approaching to observe the amulet she held, "She found it in the river. The day we met," he explained, with a voice that seemed to come from very far away. "She said it was the same color as my eyes. That it was a sign." Grace looked at the stone with new eyes. Indeed, that deep green was very similar to Samuel's gaze. A chill ran down her spine, thinking of the woman who had found that symbol, who had seen in it a promise of shared future. "You must have loved her very much," she murmured, feeling a knot in her throat. Samuel nodded slightly. Without taking his eyes off the amulet, it was quick, the fever. "I couldn't do anything." There was a world of contained pain in those broken phrases. Grace felt her heart contract, imagining Samuel, so strong and capable in everything else, completely powerless against the illness that took his wife from him. "I'm so sorry," she said, knowing the words were insufficient, but needing to express her empathy. To her surprise, Samuel took her hand, the one holding the stone, and closed it gently, wrapping her fingers around the amulet. "Keep it," he said with a firmness that brooked no reply. Grace looked at him astonished. "I can't accept it, Samuel. It's all you have left of her." He shook his head, and Grace saw in his eyes a determination that mixed past pain with something new, something pointing toward the future. "It's not all," he replied. "I have the memories. But this—" He gently pressed Grace's hand where the stone rested. "This should be with someone who is alive, who has a path ahead." The meaning of that gesture hit Grace with the force of a revelation. It wasn't simply a gift. It was a transfer, a permission to occupy a space that had remained empty for 5 years. Not to replace Margaret, never that, but to exist alongside her memory, to weave a new story from the broken threads of the past. With trembling hands, Grace placed the cord around her neck. The stone rested over her heart, cool despite the day's heat. Like a silent promise. "I'll take care of it," she promised, her eyes moist. Samuel nodded once more, and then, in a gesture that took Grace completely by surprise, he leaned down and placed a kiss on her forehead. It was brief contact, almost ghostly, but charged with a meaning that made the world stop for an instant. "I know," he replied simply, then walked away toward the corral where the horses demanded attention. Grace remained motionless, her hand over the stone that now belonged to her. Felicia. Now she had just received not only an object, but a trust that weighed as much as that small amulet. The responsibility of honoring a past that wasn't hers and, at the same time, the invitation to build a future that until now had only been a diffuse dream. That night, when darkness enveloped the small property, and stars spread like a mantle over the desert, Grace found Samuel sitting on the porch, contemplating the horizon with eyes that seemed to see beyond the present. She sat beside him, maintaining respectful distance but closer than on previous days. The silence between them was like a third presence, not uncomfortable, but full of unexpressed possibilities. Grace caressed the stone now hanging from her neck, feeling a connection with the woman she never knew, but whose absence had shaped the life she now shared with Samuel. "Do you think she would approve?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. Samuel took so long to respond that Grace thought he wouldn't. But when he spoke, his voice had a certainty that surprised her. "Margaret wanted me to live, not survive," he said. "There's a difference." Grace understood then that the gift of the amulet hadn't been only for her, but also for himself. An act of liberation, a hesitant step toward a life that wasn't defined solely by loss. Under the desert's starry sky, with the green stone resting over her heart, Grace felt something new beginning to sprout between them. As fragile as a desert plant, but equally tenacious. It wasn't love, not yet, but it contained its seed. And as she had learned in those months, even in the most arid terrain with enough care and patience, life could flourish. The discovery occurred one afternoon while Grace was organizing Samuel's few books. Between the pages of an old agriculture manual, she found a yellowed envelope, without stamps or address, only with the name Margaret, written in angular handwriting she recognized as Samuel's. The envelope was open, the letter inside partially unfolded. Grace knew she should return it to its hiding place, respect the privacy of that man who so jealously guarded his feelings. But something in the date written in the upper corner, 3 years after Margaret's death, awakened her curiosity irresistibly. With her heart beating rapidly, as if committing an act of betrayal, she extracted the letter and began to read. Margaret, the preacher says you're in a better place. But for me, the only better place would be where I could see you again. 3 years have passed and the house remains empty without you. I wonder what you would say about the new colts, or about the roof I finally repaired as you always asked me to. Sometimes I think I hear your laughter in the wind, but then I remember I'll never hear it again and the silence becomes larger. I don't know why I write this. You'll never read it. Maybe I just need to believe that somehow you know I'm still here, that I keep remembering you, that each day without you is half a day. They say time heals all wounds, lies. You only learn to live with the pain, to carry it like you carry a stone in your pocket. Always present, but now familiar. I loved you. I love you. And that is my condemnation and my comfort. Samuel. Grace folded the letter with trembling hands, feeling tears blur her vision. It wasn't just the painful beauty of those words that moved her, but the revelation of the man who had written them, a Samuel she had never known, capable of tenderness and eloquence that his habitual laconicism hid. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Samuel's presence until his shadow fell over her. She looked up, her face reddened with shame and her eyes moist with emotion. "I'm sorry," she stammered, extending the letter as evidence of her transgression. "I shouldn't have—" She expected anger, perhaps even for him to ask her to leave for having violated his intimacy that way. But Samuel simply took the letter, looked at it briefly, then left it on the table, as if it were any object and not the naked confession of his deepest pain. "It was the anniversary," he said, in a voice so low Grace barely heard him. 3 years later, and I was still talking to her. There was a vulnerability in that admission that completely disarmed Grace. It wasn't just that Samuel wasn't angry. It was that he was sharing with her something that she intuited he had never shared with anyone else. "It's beautiful," she dared to say. "The letter. Your words." Samuel sketched a sad smile, barely a slight lifting at the corner of his lips. "Margaret always said I spoke too little," he commented, with a hint of irony. "That I saved words like they were gold coins." Grace couldn't help smiling at that image. "Perhaps you were just reserving them for when they really mattered," she suggested, and saw how something changed in Samuel's expression, as if that simple observation had revealed something about himself he had never considered. He sat across from her, his shoulders slightly fallen, as if the weight of memories was momentarily too much to bear. "I wrote many," he confessed, "for years. As if I could keep her alive through words." Grace nodded, understanding that impulse to cling to the absent through gestures they knew futile, but that somehow helped bear the loss. "And did it work?" she asked softly. Samuel looked directly at her then with an intensity that pierced her. "No," he replied with brutal honesty, "but it kept me alive." In that simple phrase, Grace glimpsed the entire journey traveled by that solitary man. How the letters had been anchors that held him to life when it would have been easier to let himself be dragged by the current of despair. "I haven't written any in months," Samuel added, and there was in his voice a mixture of guilt and liberation that Grace understood perfectly. She instinctively touched the stone amulet hanging from her neck, that first gift she had received from him, that symbol of a past honored, but beginning to give way to a different present. "Maybe you don't need them anymore," she suggested, with an audacity that surprised her. Samuel looked at her for a long time, as if considering her words with a seriousness that made them more significant than she had intended. Maybe, he conceded finally, and in that single word, Grace felt a door opening toward possibilities that until then had remained closed. That night, when darkness enveloped the small cabin and the desert silence was interrupted only by the occasional howl of a distant coyote, Grace found on her bed a folded sheet of paper. Opening it, she immediately recognized Samuel's angular handwriting, but this time the name written wasn't Margaret but Grace. With her heart beating wildly, she read the few lines it contained. Grace, words have never been easy for me, but I want you to know that your presence has brought light to a place that had been in shadows too long. Thank you for that. It wasn't a declaration of love, nor even of affection. It was something more fundamental, a recognition, gratitude born from the deepest place. Grace pressed the note against her chest, feeling those simple words were more valuable than any grandiose promise, because she understood what they meant, coming from a man who had guarded his words like gold coins. That he had chosen to share some with her was a gift that went beyond any physical gesture. That night, Grace slept with the note under her pillow and the stone amulet over her heart, feeling that two distinct epochs of Samuel's life, the painful past and a present beginning to awaken, were intertwining with her own destiny in a way she never could have imagined when she arrived. Desperate and exhausted, at that small property in the Arizona desert, autumn brought cooler winds and a subtle change in the light that bathed the desert. Grace had learned to read these changes, to feel in her skin the passage of seasons that in the city she had barely noticed. Her body, once fragile, had strengthened with daily work, and her hands, now weathered, spoke of a life different from the one she had known. That morning, while they repaired together the corral fence damaged by a recent storm, Grace observed Samuel's hands, large, rough, with scars that told stories of survival. Hands that knew how to build, repair, tame wild horses. Hands that, on rare occasions, had brushed hers with a delicacy that contrasted with their appearance. "Pass me the hammer," Samuel asked, interrupting her thoughts. Grace handed it to him, and their fingers met briefly on the tool's handle. They no longer started at these fleeting contacts. They had become part of their shared daily life, small bridges built between two islands of solitude. They worked in silence, as was their custom. They didn't need words to coordinate their movements. Months of shared labor had taught them to anticipate each other's needs, to move in a silent dance of efficiency and mutual respect. When they finished, they contemplated their work with identical satisfaction. The fence was firm again, ready to resist the onslaughts of the approaching winter. Grace wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving without realizing it a smudge of earth on her skin. Samuel looked at her and, in an unexpected gesture, extended his hand toward her. With his thumb, gently, he cleaned the smudge from her forehead. It was brief, apparently casual contact, but one that sent an electric current down Grace's spine. "Thank you," she murmured, feeling blush tinge her cheeks. He nodded with that economy of gestures that characterized him, but didn't look away. His green eyes, habitually inscrutable, now seemed to search for something in Grace's face, as if trying to memorize every line, every shadow. "Your hands are no longer the same," Samuel observed suddenly, taking one of Grace's hands in his to examine it. It was true. The hands that had arrived at Samuel's property months ago, with broken but still delicate nails, had transformed. Now they showed calluses, small scars, skin hardened by constant work with earth, animals, tools. "Everything about me has changed," Grace replied, with an honesty that surprised her. Samuel nodded again, as if he understood perfectly what she meant. And perhaps he did. He too had changed, in subtler but equally profound ways. The hard lines of his face had imperceptibly softened. His silences were no longer walls but shared spaces, and on rare occasions, Grace had even heard him laugh. He still held her hand, and neither seemed willing to break that contact. In that moment, under the midday sun that was beginning to lose its summer strength, Grace had the certainty that something was about to change between them. Something as inevitable as the passage of seasons. "Grace," Samuel began, with a hesitation improper of him, But a horse's whinny broke the moment. Both looked toward the corral, where the animal was agitating nervously. Samuel released Grace's hand and headed there with quick steps. She followed him, aware that whatever he had been about to say would have to wait. The rest of the day passed in usual routine, but Grace felt a new tension in the air, like electricity that precedes a storm. During dinner, shared as always in comfortable silence interrupted only by practical comments about the next day's tasks, she caught Samuel looking at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. That night, when Grace was preparing to retire to her small corner of the cabin, Samuel stopped her with a gesture. "Wait," he said, and there was a determination in his voice that immediately captured Grace's attention. He headed toward a small chest he rarely opened and extracted something he kept hidden in his closed hand. When he returned beside her, uncertainty had replaced the determination in his expression. "This was my mother's," he explained, slowly opening his hand to reveal a simple silver ring with a small blue stone set in it. She told me to give it to someone who would make my house a home." Grace held her breath. The meaning of that gesture, of those words, was as clear as well water on a windless morning. "Samuel," she began, but he interrupted her. "You don't have to say anything now," he said quickly. "Just, I wanted you to know, to have it." He offered her the ring, and Grace took it with trembling hands. It wasn't a formal proposal, not exactly. It was something more. A confession. An open door toward a future that until now had only been a nebulous possibility on the horizon of their lives. "It's beautiful," she murmured, admiring the elegant simplicity of the jewel. "Like you," Samuel replied, with a voice so low Grace almost thought she had imagined it, but the intensity of his gaze confirmed she had heard correctly. For the first time since they had known each other, Samuel had openly expressed his admiration for her, had put into words what until then he had only communicated through gestures and glances. Grace felt her heart beating so hard she feared he might hear it. With still trembling fingers, she slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a bit large, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the symbol, the implicit promise in that circle of silver that now united them. "Thank you," she said, knowing the word was insufficient to express everything she felt, but trusting that Samuel, who had learned to read in her silences as much as she in his, would understand. He nodded, and then, in a gesture that clearly cost him great effort of will, he leaned down and brushed her lips with his. It was barely a touch, as light as a feather's caress, but it contained a promise that made Grace's world tremble to its foundations. When they separated, there was no need for more words. The language of their intertwined hands, of their gazes that no longer hid what they felt, was more eloquent than any declaration. That night, when they finally retired to their separate spaces, he to his room, she to her corner of the living room, Grace contemplated the ring that now adorned her finger, shining faintly in the moonlight filtering through the window. Together with the stone amulet hanging from her neck, the ring formed part of a new narrative, one in which her desperate arrival at that property hadn't been the end of one path but the beginning of another, unexpected but infinitely more promising. Dark clouds accumulated on the horizon, foretelling one of the storms that rarely struck that arid region. Grace watched them from the porch, feeling in the air that special electricity that preceded rain, that aroma of thirsty earth preparing to drink. Samuel had departed for town that morning, something that occurred barely once a month, to stock up on provisions they couldn't produce on the property. Grace had insisted on accompanying him, but he had refused, worried about signs of bad weather. "I'll be back before nightfall," he had promised, sealing his words with a kiss that was no longer timid or fleeting, but full and sure. Now, as the first drops began to strike the cabin's roof, with a drumming that soon became thunderous, Grace couldn't help the worry that pressed against her chest. Samuel should have returned already. The premature darkness brought by the storm would make the journey difficult, and the dry streams could quickly transform into dangerous torrents. She paced restlessly through the small living room, stopping occasionally to look through the window, though the curtain of rain barely allowed her to see beyond the porch. Wind howled around the cabin, and lightning illuminated the landscape briefly, transforming it into a phantasmagorical vision of shadows and light. It was during one of those flashes that she saw him, a figure on horseback approaching laboriously toward the property. The relief she felt was so intense that her knees nearly gave way. Without caring about the rain, Grace ran out to meet Samuel. Water soaked her in seconds, plastering her dress to her body and dragging her hair in darkened strands. But none of that mattered. All that counted was that he had returned, that he was safe. Samuel dismounted with difficulty, and Grace noticed he was limping slightly. His face, illuminated by another lightning flash, showed an expression of contained pain that she immediately recognized. "What happened?" she shouted over the storm's roar, approaching to help him. "The horse got spooked by lightning," he explained, leaning on her to walk toward the cabin. "I fell badly. It's nothing serious." But Grace knew Samuel tended to minimize his own ailments. Once inside by lamplight, she could see that his pants were torn and stained with blood at knee-height. "Sit down," she ordered, with a firmness that brooked no reply. "I need to see that." To her surprise, Samuel obeyed without protesting, allowing her to carefully cut the fabric of his pants to examine the wound. It was a deep cut, probably caused by a sharp rock during the fall. "It needs cleaning and stitches," Grace determined, remembering basic healing skills she had learned in gentler times of her life. "We'll have to go to the doctor as soon as the storm calms." "You can do it," he said, with a confidence that overwhelmed her. "I trust you." Those 3 words, "I trust you," resonated inside Grace like a bell. Trust, that precious and fragile good, was being handed to her without reservations by a man who had spent years building walls around himself. Without saying anything more, Grace got to work. She boiled water, cleaned the wound with the alcohol they kept for emergencies, prepared needle and thread. Her hands, which barely months ago would have trembled at such a task, now moved with precision and security. As she worked, with Samuel watching her in stoic silence, Grace remembered the journey traveled since that afternoon, when she had arrived. Desperate and directionless at this same cabin, she remembered her initial plea, "I cannot live without a man," and marveled at how different its meaning was now. It was no longer a confession of weakness, but of choice. She didn't depend on Samuel to survive. She had learned to fend for herself, to find strength in her own capacity, but she had chosen to stay, to share her life with him, to build something that was greater than the sum of their solitudes. "Done," she said finally, cutting the thread after the last stitch. "It's not my best sewing, but it'll hold." Samuel looked at her work and then at her, with an expression that mixed admiration and something deeper, something that made Grace's heart race. "You're extraordinary," he said simply. Grace felt herself blush. She still wasn't accustomed to Samuel's direct compliments, which had become more frequent since the night he had given her his mother's ring. "I only did what was necessary," she replied. Downplaying her actions, "No," he insisted, taking her hand. "Your ex?" "Extraordinary, Grace. You've brought life to a place that was dead. You've—" He stopped as if the words he sought were stuck in his throat. Grace waited, giving him the time he needed, knowing from experience that Samuel couldn't be hurried when it came to expressing his feelings. "I love you," he said finally, with a simplicity that contrasted with the magnitude of the declaration. Grace felt the world stop. Those 2 words, which she had heard before in her life but never with the naked sincerity with which Samuel pronounced them now, fell upon her like an unexpected gift. They weren't just words. They were a promise, a future, a certainty in the midst of a world full of uncertainties. "I love you too," she replied, her voice broken with emotion. And then, as if nature wanted to seal that moment, an especially intense lightning flash illuminated the cabin, followed almost immediately by thunder that made the walls tremble. The lamp went out, leaving them in darkness interrupted only by occasional flashes of the storm. In that semi-darkness, Grace felt Samuel's hands seeking her face, cradling it with a tenderness that contradicted his rough appearance. And then his lips, warm and sure, finding hers in a kiss that was both culmination and beginning. Outside, the storm raged with unleashed fury, but inside that small cabin, 2 souls who had known pain, loss, and solitude finally found a safe harbor in each other. And in that moment, while wind howled and rain struck the roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, Grace made her decision. This was her home, this was her place in the world. Not because she couldn't live without Samuel, but because she had chosen to live with him, to share her life, her work, her silences, and now, also her words of love. The cracked mirror returned to Grace a fragmented image of herself, as if wanting to remind her that the person she had been and who she was now could no longer be reconciled in a single vision. She observed her face, bronzed by the desert sun, her eyes that seemed deeper, wiser than before, her hair that had recovered part of its original shine, thanks to the care she could now afford. It was her birthday, though she hadn't mentioned it to Samuel. Celebrations seemed an unnecessary luxury in the austere life they led, and besides, that date had always brought her bittersweet memories of her former life. However, as she arranged her hair with special care that morning, she couldn't help but let memories surface like water between the cracks of a dam, her childhood in a large but cold house, where affection was measured in obedience, her early marriage to a man who had promised to love her, but who, when business failed and money disappeared, had abandoned her to her fate. The months of wandering, of closed doors, of looks that judged a woman alone as if she were a contagious disease. And then, the desperate decision to seek refuge in that small property she had spotted from the road. The humiliating confession, "I cannot live without a man," that had been both her greatest shame and her unexpected salvation. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her reflections. Samuel had left early, muttering something about checking the cattle in the north pasture, and Grace didn't expect him until afternoon. "Grace," he called, with an inflection in his voice that she recognized as nervousness, a rare emotion in someone habitually so contained. She emerged from the small room they now shared, curious about that anticipated return. Samuel was standing in the center of the living room, holding something wrapped in a worn cloth. His eyes, under his perpetually furrowed brow, shone with contained emotion. "Happy birthday," he said simply, extending the package toward her. I didn't tell you. I found the date in your papers," he explained, with a slight blush rising on his weathered face. "The ones that came by mail from the courthouse when we registered the property in your name, too." Grace felt a knot form in her throat. That legal gesture, performed weeks ago, had been Samuel's pragmatic way of ensuring her future, of guaranteeing that whatever happened, she would always have a place to belong. "You didn't have to do it," she murmured, referring to both the gift and the gesture of remembering her birthday. "I wanted to do it," he replied, with that direct simplicity that was his hallmark. "Open the package." With trembling hands, Grace unfolded the cloth. Inside rested a book, old but well preserved, with leather covers worn by use. Opening it, she saw it was a poetry collection, with some pages marked by small dried flowers, and notes written in the margins in delicate handwriting that wasn't Samuel's. "It was my mother's," he explained, confirming Grace's suspicion. "She used to read me these poems when I was a child. She said beautiful words make us better people." Grace ran her fingers over the yellowed pages, moved by the value of that gift. It wasn't just an object. It was a fragment of Samuel's past, a window into a part of his life he rarely mentioned. "It's precious," she said, feeling the word was terribly inadequate to express what she felt. "Thank you." Samuel nodded but seemed restless, as if there was something more he wanted to say or do. Grace waited, accustomed to giving him the space he needed to find words. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something I want to ask you." Grace's heart quickened. There was a solemnity in his tone that suggested what he was about to say wasn't trivial. "Grace Bennett," he began, and though his voice was firm, Grace could detect an underlying tremor. "Would you like to be my wife? Not before the law, which already recognizes us as family in the papers, but before ourselves." The proposal, formulated with that mixture of formality and awkwardness, so characteristic of Samuel, hit Grace with the force of a revelation. It wasn't just a commitment he was offering her. It was the possibility of a new beginning, of rewriting her story, not as a woman who couldn't live without a man, but as one who had chosen, with full consciousness and freedom, to share her life with someone who valued her for what she was. "Yes," she replied simply, knowing Samuel would appreciate the lack of circumlocution, the clarity of her response. "Nothing would make me happier." The smile that drew itself on Samuel's face, transforming his habitually austere features into something almost luminous, was a gift in itself, more valuable than any material object. That night, sitting in front of the fireplace lit to combat the growing cold of advanced autumn, Grace read aloud some of the poems marked in the book. The words, ancient but vibrant with life, filled the small cabin like music neither had heard in a long time, and as she read, with Samuel listening attentively beside her, Grace felt that the fragments of her image in the cracked mirror finally found an order, a coherence. The woman she had been, with her mistakes, her fears, her moments of desperation, and the woman she now was, strong, capable, Loved weren't separate entities, but parts of the same journey. Stages of a path that had led her against all odds, toward a home she didn't know she was seeking. The last light of day filtered through the flower sack curtains she had made herself, tinting the room with a warm gold that seemed to bless that moment, that promise of shared future. And as shadows lengthened and night claimed its dominion, Grace let the book rest on her lap and rested her head on Samuel's shoulder, feeling that in that simple gesture of intimacy resided a deeper truth than any poem ever written. The town of Red Rock barely deserved such a name. A main street flanked by a dozen wooden buildings, a small church whose tower leaned slightly westward, a saloon that served as social center for the ranchers and miners in the area. It was a place where rumors traveled faster than horses, and where a woman alone or in the wrong company could become the topic of conversation for weeks. Grace knew this well. Though she rarely visited the town, preferring the peace of the small property she now considered home, she was aware of the looks she received when she accompanied Samuel on his monthly visits for supplies. Curious looks, some hostile, others simply evaluative, as if trying to determine exactly what type of woman she was. That day, however, she had insisted on accompanying him. The news of their engagement, though celebrated privately between them, needed to be formalized before the justice of the peace, and Grace felt it was important to face together whatever the town might have to say about it. As they rode side by side along the dusty path, Grace felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. Samuel's mother's ring shone on her finger, now properly adjusted thanks to a thread wound around the interior, and the green stone amulet rested over her heart like a protective talisman. "It doesn't have to matter what they say," Samuel said suddenly, as if he had read her thoughts. Grace smiled. "Grateful for that show of understanding." "I know," she replied, "but we're part of this community, even though we live apart. And I want them to know I'm here to stay." Samuel nodded, with that economy of gestures she had learned to interpret as approval. They didn't need many words between them. Months of coexistence had taught them to read in each other's silences as makune, as in their scarce verbal expressions. The town appeared before them like a ochre stain in the middle of the reddish landscape. As they approached, Grace could distinguish figures moving on the main street, the coming and going of daily life in that forgotten corner of the desert. They tied their horses in front of the general store, and Grace immediately felt how conversation stopped at their arrival, how gazes converged on her and Samuel, on their intertwined hands, on the ring she now wore openly. The store's interior smelled of leather, tobacco, and freshly ground coffee. The owner, a corpulent man with a thick mustache that partially hid his expression, greeted them with a nod. "Crawford," he said, and then, after brief hesitation, added, "Miss Bennett." "Mrs. Crawford soon," Samuel corrected. With a firmness that left no doubt about his intention, a thick silence fell over the store. Grace could feel the gazes of other customers, the weight of unspoken but clearly present judgments. She lifted her chin, refusing to show the insecurity she still sometimes felt when faced with outside scrutiny. "Congratulations," the storekeeper finally said, breaking the silence with a word that sounded more like obligation than sincerity. Samuel nodded briefly and began enumerating the supplies they needed. Grace moved through the store, selecting some additional items: thread for her sewing, a new hairbrush, seeds for the small garden she had begun beside the cabin. It was then she heard them, two women set apart in a corner of the store, whispering to each other with the indiscretion of those who wish to be heard. The same one who arrived like a vagabond degi. They say she practically offered herself to him, and now she thinks she has the right to be a respectable lady. The words, sharp as razors, buried themselves in Grace with surgical precision, pointing exactly at the insecurities she thought she had overcome. For an instant, she felt herself becoming again that desperate, humiliated woman who had begged for refuge in one last act of survival. But then she remembered everything that had happened since then, the hard work that had dignified her days, the confidence earned through effort, the love that had flourished not from need but from mutual recognition of two kindred souls. And above all, she remembered Samuel's words, spoken with that stark honesty that was his seal, "You're extraordinary." She left the items she had selected on the counter and turned toward the women, who were startled to find themselves discovered in their murmuring. "Ladies," she said, with a clear voice that captured everyone's attention. "I would like to invite you to our wedding. It will be simple but sincere, like the man with whom I have chosen to share my life." The silence that followed her words was absolute. Grace could feel Samuel's gaze upon her, probably surprised by that show of audacity that contrasted with her usual discretion. The women, their faces reddened with shame at being confronted, muttered something unintelligible and hurried to leave the store. Grace watched them go, feeling not satisfaction but a strange peace. She hadn't responded to cruelty with more cruelty, but with an invitation to truly know her, to be part of the new life she was building. When they left the store, their arms loaded with supplies, Samuel looked at her with an expression that mixed amazement and pride. "You didn't have to do that," he said, repeating the words she herself had used so many times. "I wanted to do it," Grace replied, returning his own words with a smile. The justice of the peace, an elderly man with surprisingly sharp eyes, received them in his small office without showing any particular reaction to their request. He recorded the engagement in the corresponding book, explained the procedure for the ceremony that would take place in 2 weeks, and wished them happiness with a formality that didn't allow guessing his real thoughts about the union. As they rode back, with the sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, Grace felt a lightness she hadn't expected. The town's voices, which she had so feared, had lost their power over her. What mattered weren't others' judgments, but the truth she and Samuel knew, that they had found in each other not a solution to solitude, but a companion for a journey both had chosen freely. The desert stretched before them, vast and indifferent to small human dramas, and in the midst of that immensity, Grace understood that true refuge wasn't the cabin she now called home, nor even Samuel's love, but the strength she had discovered in herself, the capacity to face the world with her head high, sure of her own worth. The day dawned with perfect clarity, as if the sky itself wanted to bless the occasion. Grace woke before dawn, with that expectant nervousness that accompanies life's transcendent moments. She dressed in silence, putting on the blue dress she had made with her own hands, now embellished with simple white lace at the neck and cuffs, an unexpected gift from the blacksmith's wife, who, against all expectations, had responded to her invitation with a gesture of reconciliation. Samuel had spent the night in the shed, insisting on respecting the tradition of not seeing the bride before the ceremony. Grace smiled at that gesture, so incongruous with the practical, unpretentious life they led, but which revealed a hidden romanticism she had learned to value. She approached the small cracked mirror and observed her reflection. The face that returned her gaze was no longer that of the desperate woman who had arrived months ago, begging for refuge. Her eyes shone with quiet confidence, her cheeks had recovered a healthy color, and something in her bearing spoke of a reclaimed dignity that had nothing to do with external circumstances and everything to do with the inner journey she had undertaken. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her contemplation. "Grace?" called Elena's voice, the blacksmith's wife, who had insisted on helping her prepare. "Are you ready?" Grace opened the door, grateful for that feminine presence on such a significant day. Elena entered, carrying in her hands a small bouquet of freshly cut wildflowers, tied with a blue ribbon that matched her dress. "Oh, Grace," she exclaimed upon seeing her. "You look beautiful." Grace felt herself blush at the compliment. She still wasn't accustomed to being the object of admiration, to being seen not as a burden or anomaly, but as someone worthy of appreciation. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the bouquet, "for the flowers and for being here." Eleanor, a robust woman with kind eyes that hid their own story of difficulties, nodded understandingly. "Women must support each other," she said simply. "This place can be hard for those of us who are alone." Grace understood then why Elena had been the first to build a bridge toward her. She recognized in her story echoes of her own, saw beyond the rumors to find the truth of a woman who, like herself, had fought to build a dignified life in adverse circumstances. Together they left the cabin toward the small clearing beside the stream where the ceremony would take place. Grace had chosen that place because it was there where she and Samuel used to sit in the afternoons, sharing silence or, increasingly frequently, their thoughts and memories. It was a space that already contained part of their shared history, a silent witness to their evolution from strangers to companions, from refugees from solitude to allies against it. A small group of people had gathered there, the justice of the peace, serious and formal in his worn black suit. The blacksmith and his children, rough but respectful in their best Sunday clothes, some neighbors from nearby ranches who had accepted the invitation, perhaps moved by curiosity, perhaps by genuine desire to witness something positive in the harshness of frontier life. And there, standing beside an improvised altar made with stones from the stream, was Samuel. Grace held her breath upon seeing him. He had managed a dark suit he probably hadn't worn in years, and had shaved completely, revealing a face younger and more vulnerable than she remembered. But what moved her most was his expression, a mixture of nervousness, pride, and something deeper, a naked emotion he wasn't trying to hide. When their gazes met, everything else seemed to vanish. The small group of witnesses didn't exist, nor the past both carried, nor the town voices that had judged them. Only the two of them at the dawn of a new day, ready to speak aloud what their hearts already knew. Grace walked toward him with firm steps, feeling that each one brought her closer not only to Samuel, but to the version of herself she had been seeking without knowing it. A whole woman, capable, deserving of love not for what she could offer, but for who she was. The ceremony was brief and simple, as befitted two people who preferred facts to words. The judge spoke about marriage's commitments, about the importance of loyalty and mutual respect, values Grace and Samuel had already demonstrated in their months of coexistence. When it came time for vows, an expectant silence fell over the small group. Grace had feared this moment, aware of Samuel's difficulties expressing his feelings in public. But to her surprise, he took a small folded paper from his jacket pocket and, with a clear though jolly trembling voice, began to read. "Grace," he said, "when you came to my door, I was a man who had forgotten how to live. I only existed day after day without purpose or joy. You reminded me that life is more than surviving. It's sharing. It's growing. It's daring to feel again." He paused, and Grace could see his eyes shining with contained tears, a sight so unusual in that stoic man that it left her breathless. "I promise you," he continued, "that I will never forget what you've taught me, that each day I will try to be worthy of the trust you've placed in me, that together we will build something neither could have built alone." The words, simple but deeply felt, resonated in Grace like absolute truth. When her turn came, she had no prepared paper, but words flowed naturally from her heart. "Samuel, I came to you believing I couldn't live without a man. I stay with you knowing I can live by myself, but choosing to share my life with you. Not out of necessity, but out of love. Not from fear of solitude, but from the joy of companionship." She took his hands in hers, feeling the roughness of years of hard work, the solidity that had been her anchor in moments of doubt. "I promise you honesty, respect, and an open heart. I promise to work beside you, dream beside you, and remind you when you forget that you deserve as much happiness as you've given me." The exchange of rings was symbolic, his mother's ring now properly fitted for her. A simple silver band Grace had bought with her own savings for him, but the true symbol of their union was the green stone amulet hanging from Grace's neck, that first gift that had marked the beginning of their journey from distrust to intimacy. When the judge declared them husband and wife, and Samuel leaned down to kiss her with a tenderness that belied his rough appearance, Grace felt she was completing a circle. The woman who had arrived saying, "I cannot live without a man," now understood the deeper truth, that true love isn't born from dependence but from freedom, not from need but from conscious choice to walk alongside another. The sun rose in the sky, bathing the small clearing with golden light that seemed to augur luminous days to come, and as the attendees approached to congratulate them, Grace knew that, regardless of what the future held, she had already found what she had truly been seeking all her life, not external refuge, but the inner strength to create a home wherever she might be. A year had passed since that morning beside the stream, when Grace and Samuel had united their lives before the eyes of the small community. A year of shared work, of conversations that had become more fluid over time, of silences that no longer needed to be filled because they contained their own language. Grace now contemplated her most precious creation, the small garden she had managed to wrest from the desert through tenacity and accumulated knowledge. Where before there had been only parched earth and scattered cacti, now flourished plants resistant to drought, aromatic herbs, and even some flowers that added improbable touches of color to the ochre landscape. It was a modest but significant miracle, testimony to what patience and constant care could achieve even in the most adverse circumstances. For Grace, that garden was also a metaphor for her own transformation. Like those plants, she had found a way to flourish in an environment that initially seemed hostile to her existence. Samuel approached from behind, encircling her with his arms in a gesture that had become natural between them. His face, still weathered by sun and wind, now showed different expression lines, some from laughter, others from concentration when he read the books Grace had obtained on her visits to town. "It's beautiful," he said, contemplating the garden. "Like everything you touch." Grace smiled, leaning against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his worn shirt. "It wasn't just my work," she replied. "Without the well you dug, none of this would be possible." It was true. Months ago, when Grace had expressed her desire to try a small garden, Samuel had spent weeks digging an additional well closer to the house, searching for the water he knew ran beneath the arid surface. It had been an act of faith as much as love, a bet on a future that included more than mere survival, and so it had been with every aspect of their shared life. He contributing strength and constancy, she vision and tenderness, both learning from each other, growing together in ways neither could have imagined possible. The small cabin, once austere to the point of desolation, now showed signs of a genuine home. Curtains on all windows, a table always with fresh flowers, books stacked beside the fireplace, and on the walls drawings Grace had begun making, capturing the severe beauty of the desert and the simple nobility of its inhabitants. They had even added an additional room, built by both during the cooler months, a space that harbored hopes not yet expressed aloud but present in their hearts. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, attentive to that contemplative silence he had learned to recognize in her. Grace turned her head slightly, resting her cheek against his arm, allowing herself to enjoy the contact. "About life's circles," she replied softly. "How I came here thinking I was at the end of my path, and it turns out it was only the beginning." A bird descended onto one of the plants, confidently pecking at seeds Grace had deliberately left unharvested. It was a regular visitor, one of many that had begun frequenting that small oasis created by human hands. Samuel and Grace watched it in silence, sharing the satisfaction of having added life to a place where before only survival existed. "Sometimes I wonder," Grace began, but stopped, uncertain how to express the thought that had been maturing inside her for weeks. "Tell me," Samuel encouraged her, with that patience he had cultivated, learning to wait for the natural unfolding of Grace's words, just as he waited for the flowering of desert plants. "I wonder if we'll always be alone," she said finally, her voice so quiet it almost blended with the wind's whisper among the plants. "You and me." Samuel remained silent for a moment, and Grace could feel his breathing, how it became slightly deeper as he processed the implicit question in her words. "I don't think we're alone," he replied finally. "We have the neighbors, the town. Little by little they've been accepting us." Grace smiled, recognizing the communication pattern they had established, she suggesting obliquely, he responding first to the surface, before diving into deeper waters. "That's not what I meant," she clarified gently, instinctively bringing her hand toward her belly in a gesture that contained both hope and uncertainty. Samuel followed the movement with his gaze, and Grace felt his body tense slightly behind her. It wasn't rejection, she knew well. It was the reaction of a man accustomed to protecting himself from longing, to not allowing himself to dream too much, for fear of loss. "Are you—" he began, unable to complete the question. Grace shook her head. "No, not yet," she replied. "But I've been thinking about it. About how it would be. About whether it's something you would desire." Samuel loosened his embrace and stepped back, not to distance himself, but to be able to look into her eyes. His face, usually reserved, now showed a vulnerability Grace had learned to value as the most precious of gifts. "After Margaret," he said, his voice slightly hoarse, "I thought I would never again form a family, that I didn't deserve another chance. That maybe there was something in me that—" He interrupted himself, was unable to complete the idea. Grace took his hands, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength contained in those fingers that could be so gentle. "There's nothing defective in you, Samuel," she said firmly. "Life is sometimes cruel without reason. What happened to Margaret wasn't your fault." It was a truth they had discussed before, part of the long healing process they had undertaken together. He learning to forgive himself for not having been able to save his first wife, she reconciling with the decisions that had led her to her moment of greatest desperation. "With you I've learned to live again," Samuel confessed, "to want things I thought lost forever." He approached one of the garden plants, one Grace had rescued from among the cracks of a rock, practically dying when she found it. Now it bloomed with small yellow flowers that seemed to defy the logic of their existence. "If this place can harbor life," he continued, gently caressing one of the petals, "why not us?" It was the answer Grace had hoped for, not expressed in direct words, but in that analogy so typical of Samuel, who had always understood better the language of earth than that of men. "We'll have time," she said, approaching to intertwine her fingers with his. "The desert has taught us patience." Samuel nodded, and his eyes, those green eyes that had been the first thing Grace noticed that distant day, now shone with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Whatever time is necessary," he confirmed. "We're building something that will last, Grace. Like this garden, like the house, like us." The sun began its descent toward the horizon, bathing the small garden with golden light that highlighted every leaf, every flower, every grain of earth. Grace contemplated the scene, marveling at how such a small space could contain so much meaning, so much promise. In that moment, under the waning evening light, with Samuel's arm around her shoulders and the aroma of plants they had cultivated together filling the air, Grace knew she had completed a journey that went far beyond physical distance. She had arrived at that small property, believing she couldn't live without a man, seeking simply survival and refuge. She remained now by choice, not necessity, having discovered in herself resources she had never suspected, a strength that didn't come from desperation but from love, for Samuel. Yes, but also for the life they had built together, for the person she had become, for the community that slowly had embraced them. "The sun is setting," Samuel commented, always attentive to nature's rhythms. "We should go inside." Grace nodded, but before moving, she turned to look once more at the garden, wanting to engrave in her memory the image of that small victory against aridity. "Sometimes it seems impossible to me," she said, "that something so fragile can survive here. In such an inhospitable place." Samuel followed her gaze, understanding she wasn't speaking only of the plants. "It's not fragility or strength that determines what survives, Grace," he replied, with that simple wisdom she had learned to value. "It's the capacity to adapt, to find what you need where you are and make it enough." Grace smiled, recognizing in his words the echo of her own inner journey. She too had learned to adapt, to find sustenance in a place that initially seemed unable to offer her anything. "Let's go home," she said, taking his hand. Together they walked toward the cabin that was no longer simple refuge, but the center of a shared world. The desert wind blew gently, carrying with it the aroma of garden plants and, beyond that, the promise of another day, another opportunity to continue building upon the solid foundations they had established. Grace wore the green stone amulet against her chest and Samuel's mother's ring on her finger, tangible symbols of a past honored and a present consciously chosen. But the true testimony to her transformation was in her gaze, in the way she now faced the horizon, not with fear of what it might bring, but with the serene confidence of one who has learned that true security doesn't come from depending on another, but from walking alongside someone by choice. The cabin door closed behind them, but the windows remained open, allowing the desert air, now sweeter thanks to the small garden, to circulate freely. And just as the wind carried plant seeds to improbable places, where they would find ways to take root and flourish, Grace knew her story would also travel, perhaps inspiring other solitary souls to believe in the possibility of rebirth, even in the most arid terrain of the heart, because in the end, that was the most valuable lesson she had learned in her journey, that even the most desperate circumstances can contain the seed of new life, if one has the courage to plant it and the patience to wait for it to bloom.